Today, we will be focusing on the economic developments in America from the original colonies to 1900. The American colonies were unique in the history of colonialism because they were originally funded and maintained by joint stock companies. These companies allowed several investors in England to pool their wealth and start a colony, in the hope that the colony would yield a profit. Once they had obtained a charter from the king to start the colony, the joint stock company accepted responsibility for maintaining the colony. In return, they would be entitled to receive back most of the profit that the colony might yield. This is different than the French and Spanish conquistadores, who were being funded directly by their monarchs. The American colonies were started as a capitalist venture. The Virginia Company was the joint stock company that founded Jamestown, the first colony located along the Chesapeake Bay. Once the colonists discovered the cash crop tobacco, the Jamestown settlement finally yielded a profit for the investors. The cash crop economy required labor, so indentured servants were recruited from Europe. Wealthy plantation owners would pay for the passage of an indentured servant who would work for a few years until they were free. Any person who could pay for their own or another's passage to the colonies would receive 50 acres of land, an arrangement called the head right system. Because of these two systems, indentured servitude and head right, immigration to the colonies skyrocketed. However, the plantation owners in Virginia couldn't expand their profits because they still lacked enough labor. Eventually, they turned to slave labor. In the early 1600s, the high cost of slave labor prohibited many people from using enslaved Africans on their plantations. But by the late 1600s, the overall wealth of the colonists had increased, and the number of white indentured servants had decreased. Therefore, colonists began importing slaves in much higher numbers. The Massachusetts Bay Company was the joint stock company that was founded by Puritans in New England. Here, the economy differed greatly from that of Virginia. Winters were more harsh and the soil was rockier and less fertile. Thus, a plantation economy based on slave labor was not feasible in New England. Instead, colonists in New England focused on small family farms, lumber, fishing, manufacturing, and commerce. Many of New England's wealthiest members were merchants who shipped goods to and from England. As you can see on this map, New England merchants would also ship rum and other products to Africa to sell them for slaves. These merchants would bring the slaves to the Indies, where they would sell them for sugar and molasses, and then bring the sugar back to New England to make rum. This transatlantic trade was known as the triangular trade. Other international trade relationships were growing as well. The slave trade was entrenched in the South, which relied on cash crops for its economy. In the North, merchants were smuggling goods to other European nations besides Great Britain. While there was still more opportunity in the American colonies to become rich and move up in class, colonial society was still ruled by a strict social hierarchy, as you can see in this diagram. In the South, aristocrats and leading planters topped the social pyramid, and in the North, rich merchants were the wealthiest. The vast majority of the population of the colonies was made up of small white landowners. At the bottom of the pyramid were indentured servants and slaves. While not discussed much in textbooks, class tension was prevalent in the colonies. The most famous example is Bacon's Rebellion. By the late 1600s, many of the free white men in Virginia were former indentured servants who had little money to buy land and therefore could not vote and had almost no rights in colonial Virginia. These poor colonists lived mainly on the western outskirts of Virginia, where they constantly fought with Native Americans for land. These poor whites had to pay the most taxes, but the political and economic elites refused to use the money to protect them from the raiding Indians. Nathaniel Bacon organized an army of poor whites, indentured servants, and freed blacks, and took over Jamestown. In the end, the uprising was crushed by the governing elite, but the underlying tensions between the rich and the poor didn't disappear. By the mid-1700s, all 13 colonies had strong economies. The early days of the joint stock companies were over, however, and all the colonies were royal, owned by the King of England, or proprietorships, owned by individuals. According to this system of mercantilism, the purpose of a colony was to make the mother country rich. The colonists exported to England large amounts of raw materials and brought manufactured goods in return, as you can see in this illustration. Because of this philosophy, the English objected to the smuggling done by the colonists with other countries. Parliament tried to stop colonial smuggling with the Navigation Acts, but failed to enforce the rules through salutary neglect. The French and Indian War of the 1750s changed the situation, however. Parliament needed to recoup the costs of the expensive war they fought against the French to protect the American colonies. Parliamentary leaders believed that the colonists should pay for some of the cost through taxation. Parliament began enacting taxes, both direct and indirect, in an effort to re-establish control over their colonies after years of salutary neglect. Taxes enacted by Parliament, such as the Stamp Act, were met with furious resistance, especially in the colonies of Massachusetts and Virginia. The King and Parliament believed that Parliament virtually represented the colonies and therefore could tax them. The colonists, on the other hand, were accustomed to taxing themselves through their own elected legislatures. They objected to the new taxes, crying out against taxation without representation. Members of the ruling elite throughout the colonies began organizing protests and boycotts against British goods. As we know now, these steps were the beginning of the path to the American Revolution. The results of the American Revolution were not that radical. Yes, the newly independent country of the United States was about to become the first constitutional republic of the modern world. However, the social structure did not change. The people with power in the colonial era were still the most wealthy and powerful in the new republic. The first government created under the Articles of Confederation was very, very weak, especially concerning the role of the government in the economy. Congress could not tax or regulate interstate trade. There was no single currency, so all the states began printing their own money. While this system did give much freedom to the states, it was an impossible way to run a single nation. During the Revolution, the Second Continental Congress had raised money for the Army by selling bonds to wealthy Americans and foreigners. Under the Articles of Confederation, Congress had no way to raise the money to pay bondholders back. Another problem caused by the debt from the Revolution was a struggle between the rich, who had lent money, and the poor, who were people like farmers who had borrowed money to buy land. In each state, wealthy people who had lent money to the states enacted high taxes to get their money back. However, the high taxes were mostly paid by the poor farmers, who were already in debt. Outrage over foreclosed farms drove Daniel Shays in western Massachusetts to form an army of farmers to shut down the courts. This uprising caused panic amongst the elite in every state, who worried that a lower-class uprising would spread. This uprising, and the general weaknesses of the Articles of Confederation, led the leaders of each colony to the decision to create a new constitution. Everything the Articles of Confederation couldn't do financially, the new Constitution could. Under the stronger national government, the new Congress was given the power to tax, regulate interstate trade, issue currency, and raise an army. All these powers were put immediately to use by the first Secretary of the Treasury, Federalist Alexander Hamilton, to protect upper-class economic interests. The first Congress, under orders of Hamilton, enacted the following economic policies. Hamilton created a Bank of the United States that would issue paper money, handle tax receipts, and other government funds. Hamilton also had the federal government assume the debts of the states from the Revolution in order to make sure wealthy investors got their money back. A protective tariff was lifted to help pay off the debt. The tariff was also designed to protect American manufacturers. An excise tax was also levied on the manufacture of whiskey to raise money to pay off the debt. If you look at this diagram, you will see the structure of this economic plan under Hamilton. This tax outraged small frontier farmers who were the main whiskey farmers. In 1794, a group of farmers in western Pennsylvania organized and refused to pay the tax, starting a rebellion. Washington immediately formed a militia and put an end to the Whiskey Rebellion. It wasn't only farmers who objected to Alexander Hamilton's economic policies. A whole political party had emerged in opposition to Hamilton's Federalist policies, the Democratic Republicans, led by Thomas Jefferson. It wasn't until Jefferson was elected president in 1800 that some of these economic policies were reversed. In the meantime, the Industrial Revolution had begun in England. Mercantilism had stunted American industry, but the War of 1812 provided an unexpected stimulus. When Jefferson raised an embargo that banned all trade, the economy tanked, all except American industry, which received an extreme boost, having to provide for the internal demands of the nation. Early industrialization in the United States mostly occurred in New England, as you can see in this map. The Slater Cotton Mill in Rhode Island and the Lowell Textile Mill in Massachusetts were some of the first factories to utilize mass production techniques. A new class emerged in the United States as more and more factories were built. The working class, and of course the beginnings of a union movement first emerged as well. The first unions did not have large memberships, and most of their efforts to organize for better conditions met with failure. New inventions during the early 1800s also stimulated more industry. The steel plow and the mechanical reaper revolutionized the agricultural industry. The telegraph made instant communication around the nation and world feasible. The most influential development was the railroad. The extension of a railroad network all over New England and then linking the East Coast with the West and South created, for the first time, a national market. The increasing interdependence between the different regions of the United States stimulated the economy, but also created new political tensions. As the railroad and westward expansion brought more settlers, adventurers, and immigrants to the West, political tensions grew between North and South about whether or not the economic system of slavery would also expand westward. The invention of the cotton gin in 1793 had made the South ever more dependent on cotton and the slave labor system. Many in the North, however, felt that a free labor system was the future of the nation. In a way, industrialization made the sectional tension between North and South get worse quicker. Other economic issues were also increasing sectional tension between North and South, such as the tariff. Originally conceived by Alexander Hamilton, the tariff remained the main way to collect tax revenue and protect American industry. In the American system, key political figures enacted the tariff of 1816, the highest at that point in U.S. history. Then, in 1828, Congress proposed to increase the tariff yet again, but the southern states finally revolted. Northerners liked the tariff because it protected their economic system. Southerners hated the tariff because it kept consumer prices high and it didn't benefit them at all. They perceived it as a way the federal government was only looking after the interests of the North. By 1832, the tariff issue had reached a boiling point. South Carolina threatened to not follow the tariff laws in the nullification crisis of 1832. A compromise was made between North and South, but the distrust of the North by the South did not disappear. Another economic conflict between regions was regarding the Bank of the United States, originally created under Alexander Hamilton and then rechartered under the American system of 1815. In the same year as the nullification crisis over the tariff, President Jackson vetoed a recharter of the bank. His dislike of the bank stemmed from accusations of corruption and privilege by those who ran and invested in the bank. Many Southerners and Westerners also hated the bank because it monopolized an economic power. While these accusations are true, the destruction of the bank did more harm than good. Jackson removed the national funds from the bank and distributed them to his pet banks, various state banks that unfortunately were not reliable. Many of them were wildcat banks because they would print paper money in excess of the gold and silver reserves they maintained. This directly caused the Panic of 1837, when many of these banks failed. Businesses went bankrupt and more than one-third of the population was unemployed. After the destruction of the bank and the stability of the monetary system, every 10 years or so a new panic would occur. leading to another recession. This system of boom and bust, known as the business cycle, plagued the economy all throughout the mid and late 1800s. Two of the most serious other crises were the Panic of 1873 and the Panic of 1893. The Civil War significantly changed the American economy, just like all major wars have since then. During the Civil War, the federal government under President Lincoln took the reins of the economy in order to finance the Army. Congress enacted the first income tax in the nation's history. Congress also issued greenbacks, also known as paper currency, and sold extra bonds in order to raise money. During the war, Congress also set up a system of federally chartered banks to make banking safer for investors. In addition, the federal government decided to subsidize the construction of a national railroad by giving land grants to railroad companies. These actions profoundly helped business. The poor, however, were not satisfied. When Lincoln ordered a draft, a provision in the law allowed the wealthy to purchase replacements for $300. This sparked some of the most intense class rage ever seen in the history of our country. In New York City, riots by the poor working class against the draft rocked the city for almost 3 days. The riots were squashed, and the poor had to put on their uniforms and go to war, to what they called a rich man's war, but a poor man's fight. The economy of the North boomed during the Civil War. Northern entrepreneurs grew rich selling war supplies to the government and thus had enough money to invest in new businesses after the war, leading to rapid industrialization. New inventions aided the expanding economy, such as the Bessemer process to make stronger steel, electricity, the telephone, and the typewriter. Brilliant businessmen like Carnegie and Rockefeller created monopolies through trusts or horizontal or vertical integration. The power of the trust was so great that it seemed to dominate even the government. Congressional efforts to limit the power of the trusts, such as the Sherman Antitrust Act, were ineffectual. Big business was able to maintain its grip on the national economy through lobbying, graft, and monopolies. At this time, conditions in large northern industrial cities were horrible. Living conditions for the poor, many of whom were immigrants, were unsanitary and cramped. Working conditions were hazardous and deadly. Massive immigration kept wages low and hours long. Workers began to organize themselves into large and effective unions, such as the American Federation of Labor. For the most part, however, efforts by labor unions to gain better working conditions through collective bargaining and strikes were unsuccessful. The powerful alliance of business and government combined to keep working people oppressed. The powerful used the theory of social Darwinism to justify this social order, where the mighty crushed the weak. The gap wasn't just between the rich and poor. In the late 1800s, the gap between North and South grew wider as well, as you can see in this map. The Civil War had devastated the economy of the South, which also failed to industrialize like the North was. The majority of the South was still agricultural, but instead of slave labor, blacks were working as sharecroppers or tenant farmers, almost as bad as slavery because it kept them in continual debt and poverty. In the West, the railroad was king. After the Civil War, the Transcontinental Railroad was completed, stimulating revolutionary change in the West. The railroads brought thousands of people to the mines, to homestead, to work. New frontier towns were born and died. Cowboys and cattle roamed the seemingly endless land until settlers came and fenced it off with barbed wire. Bonanza farms increased agricultural production with new mechanized tools. The boom led to a collapse in the prices for agricultural goods, and many farmers who settled in the West lost their lands to the banks. Deflation, caused mostly because of the gold standard, high tariffs, and railroad monopolies, also combined to put financial pressure on the Western farmer. The failure of industrialization to result in any improvement in the lives of farmers prompted political action. Farmers blamed railroads and the Eastern Republican industrialists for their problems. At the state level, Farmers organized themselves into the Grange and Farmers' Alliances and passed laws regulating railroad rates. When the Supreme Court found these laws unconstitutional, Congress tried to enact a law, Interstate Commerce Act, but it was toothless. Farmers also organized a new political party called the Populist Party, which demanded a graduated income tax instead of a high tariff, and an end to the gold standard by adding silver to create inflation. Their demands were crushed in 1896 with the election of President McKinley, a Republican who kept the tariff high, maintained the gold standard, crushed unions, helped business, and, as we will see next semester, started a little war to gain foreign markets for American goods. At the beginning of the 20th century, the American dream was not a reality for most of the population. The rapid industrialization of the late 1800s radically transformed America. While business boomed and monopolies flourished under the pro-business policies of the federal government, the lives of ordinary people were transformed too, but not always for the better. The workers at the factories who made the new mass-produced goods had none of the protections and rights that we expect today. But slowly, a movement of people grew who began to put pressure on their local and state governments to make laws to change the status quo. These reformers were mainly from the middle class. They were educated, but not members of the elite. They were journalists, intellectuals, and local politicians. Together, they are now considered the foot soldiers of the progressive movement. One of the main goals of these progressives was to correct the economic injustices of industrialized life. Some of their first victories dealt with this exact problem. Child labor was finally banned at the state level. Laws limited the workday to 8 hours and 40 hours a week. Workers' compensation finally became an accepted industry practice. At the same time, journalists, known as muckrakers, did more to expose the inequalities of American society. By 1900, trusts controlled 4/5 of American industries. Ida Tarbell wrote about the corrupt business practices of the Standard Oil Company and other trusts. This helped contribute to a growing sentiment that monopolies needed to be regulated for the public good. When Teddy Roosevelt became president, he used the 20-year-old Sherman Antitrust Act to bust famous trusts like U.S. Steel. Roosevelt didn't use his trust-busting powers aggressively. He only filed suit against 44 trusts, and of those, won only a few cases. But still, his actions were unprecedented. Roosevelt also signed the Elkins and Hepburn Acts, which regulated the railroads and prevented unfair rate setting and corrupt rebates. These laws finally gave power to the federal government to regulate the railroads, an endeavor that had begun with the Interstate Commerce Act in the 1880s. Another progressive president, Woodrow Wilson, signed into law a more powerful law, the Clayton Antitrust Act, which is still used today to prevent monopolistic business practices. He also created the Federal Trade Commission in 1914, which was given the power to stop unfair or illegal business practices. By 1920, the power of business regulation was in the hands of the government. Another muckraker, Upton Sinclair, wrote an expose of the meatpacking industry called The Jungle. The book revealed not only the horrible working conditions, but the unsanitary disregard for consumer health. The Jungle sparked more reforms at the federal level. Teddy Roosevelt passed the Meat Inspection Act and the Pure Food and Drug Act of 1906, both of which required companies to guarantee the safety of their products. This was unprecedented, but what was even more unusual was when Roosevelt used his power as president to fairly negotiate a coal strike. Previously, presidents had always stepped in on the side of business owners, but this time Roosevelt took a neutral position and negotiated a settlement that was more balanced. More radical changes came with the progressive era in terms of finance. In 1914, Woodrow Wilson created the Federal Reserve, the first national banking system since Andrew Jackson destroyed the Bank of the United States in the 1830s. The Federal Reserve created 12 regional banks which could issue paper currency and set monetary policy. The Federal Reserve System brought order to the American economy after decades of financial instability. But more importantly, The Federal Reserve banks served as bankers' banks. They could loan money to banks in case of a need for more reserves, just like they did in the banking crisis of 2008. the 16th Amendment also brought order to government budgets. The 16th Amendment legalized the graduated income tax. This brought in a whole new stream of revenue, reducing the demand for such high tariffs, as you can see in the chart. Woodrow Wilson passed the Underwood Tariff, which cut tariff rates dramatically. This period of time represents a dramatic reversal from the previous century of economic policies. The laissez-faire pro-business policies of the 1800s were finally giving in to a bit of government regulation. A new idea was beginning to emerge, that the government has a duty to provide for the welfare of the people.